In this video, I'd like to go over corrective action. Corrective action is used within your lists. To navigate to your list section, you'll go to Lists and then Edit Lists. I'm going to go into my food safety temperatures. Corrective action can be used on two different item types. Those two different items are your yes or no and your measurement. For your measurement, it's based on a range that you establish, where yes or no is based on how they answer, either yes or no, and you can decide which one. Once you've established which item you'd like to use for your corrective action, we'll need to build that out. So I'm going to come into my walk-in freezer here, and as I scroll down, you'll need to make sure that you've established your unit for measure as well as a minimum and maximum range. You do need to have at least one, so you can leave it as a max 20 degrees and the freezer can go as cold as it wants and it's not going to hurt anything. And then when we come down, we'll turn on corrective action. So you'll turn on the corrective action, and once it's turned on, you have two options. You can use planned corrective action, or you can use a list that is triggered off corrective action. So here is where you're setting an action list. So very similar to sublists, if you've watched the video on sublists, where you're creating an action list for them to do specific tasks if that corrective action is triggered. So you'll want to create any of your corrective action lists either as you go or build those out first, whichever you prefer, because you can save your list and then bring in the corrective action later if you need to. As you're building it out, think of hot holding, cold holding. Is it going to be different for particular products? Or even the equipment. Your equipment, you may have to do different actions if it's not at temp, if it's a hot holding unit or cold holding. If it's a water well, for example, is the dial set to the correct number? Is your water well filled to the appropriate amount of water? Planned corrective action is going to create a new list that is completed later on, where normal corrective action is going to be completed in the moment. So let's go to the app and I'll show you what this looks like. So for my walk-in freezer, I'm going to go ahead and manually enter in the temperature, and we're going to say it's at 55 degrees. So once you've entered in it's at 55 degrees, it's going to prompt for corrective action. Now you can see it's showing a yellow triangle. This means that it is set as optional, and you can do that within every corrective action item. So you can allow that item to be optional or not, meaning if I was to submit this item, I can move on without completing the corrective action. However, once I select the corrective action button, it does require that I complete it. So I cannot cancel out and submit. It will still require me to complete that corrective action. Now, the planned corrective action is going to pop up this little box, and you're going to enter in a description. So this could be call maintenance. It could be maybe the unit was unplugged, so it could be retemp in 45 minutes. And then here you can set when it will display and the deadline. So this is by default going to give you 2 days, but you can come in and select that deadline and say, you know, it needs to be today, but we're going to give it an hour. And then we can set that. You can also establish who needs to complete the corrective action. Is it a specific person, which then you can select that individual? Is it based on the roles, or are you assigning it to yourself? And then you also have the ability to set an overdue notification to any role if the action list has not been completed. I'm going to go ahead and create this, and you'll see it has now created a new list to retemp in 45 minutes, and it has an hour deadline. So if it's reached temp, great, I can check it off, or if I need to call maintenance or whatever the action is that you decide based on the corrective action needed, that will create its own task, and then again you can assign it and have notifications. So that's your planned corrective action. With a list corrective action, when you enter in a temperature and it's prompting for corrective action, you can now see that this has a red stop sign with an exclamation point. This is letting you know this is a required corrective action, where this was optional or not required. When I select this corrective action, it will take me into the action list. So now it's having me check different items or check for different things. So is it plugged in? Is the breaker turned on? What corrective action was taken? And you can make this generic or very specific. That's one nice thing about corrective action. You decide what this list looked like, and you can build as many corrective action lists as you need. Let's go ahead and review a few more options within the corrective action here. So once you've turned on corrective action, you can decide if this is planned corrective action, meaning it's going to create a new item to be completed later on, or if it's going to be a part of an action list. Is that corrective action optional or not? And then here is where you're establishing when the corrective action is triggered. So it must be completed if the value is outside of the range. And you can do inside or outside. And one cool thing about your measurement item is you can actually have two ranges as well. So if you'd like to set two different ranges, one for maybe food safety and one for food quality, you can do that. Or if you're just staying out of that temperature danger zone and you want to set maybe your hot hold temperatures and your cold hold temperatures, and then if it's outside of either of those ranges, it'll trigger corrective action. And then also, are we requiring the employee to repeat the item? So I've replaced the product, or I've reheated it, I need to temp it again. Do I need to repeat the list? This is an automatic fail, start over. Or do we not need to repeat this item? Things like equipment may take longer for that temperature to come back into range. So typically by the time you're doing your next temperature check, that will be back in range, and if not, then you can follow up with additional corrective action if needed. So sometimes you'll have them repeat the item and sometimes you won't, and in those fun cases, they'll repeat the whole list. Now that's your corrective action for a measurement item. Now let's go to a corrective action for yes or no. We're going to come all the way to the bottom again, and your corrective action. So again, you're turning on the corrective action. Is this planned corrective action, or do you want to use a list for those action items? Is the corrective action optional? And then here, you're triggering the corrective action list if yes or no is selected. And then you're also requiring the employee to repeat the item, repeat the list, or do not repeat. So very similar to your measurement item, other than you're triggering based on the range versus the answer of a yes or no question. And just like with your sublist, if you want to see what your action list is, just click this little icon here and it'll open that list into a new tab. So you can very easily see what the action list is. You can add to it, adjust it, whatever you need.